from Matthew Pollock, Manuel Diaz-Campos, and Eric Willis on perceiving the social variation of coda liquids in Dominican Spanish exposure through travel and family connections.
Thank you very much for being with us today. You heard the title, so we'll go ahead and jump to our objective. So our objective today is to understand coda liquid perceptions in the Dominican Spanish. This presentation is part of a larger series of research on Dominican Spanish coda liquids. Today we'll be looking at attitudinal responses to lateralization, vocalization, rhoticization, and normative productions. And we will explore how attitudes toward regional variants vary by the hearer's listener or the history of travel, language exposure, and family connections. Next. The phonetic phenomena that we're looking at are coda liquids, and they are produced in different ways in the three main varieties of Dominican Spanish. In the north, in the Cibao region, we have vocalization, where both R and L are turned into a vowel, high front vowel. In the capital and eastern region, we have lateralization, where a tap is turned into a lateral. And then in the south, we have rhoticization, where an L is turned into a tap, similar to what was discussed yesterday. Next. These phenomena are so prevalent that they can actually be written in, or found in written forms in signs throughout the city. And all these signs came from the Cibao, Santiago area. Next. As far as sociolinguistic perceptions, we know that listeners can hear social characteristics of speakers. They can hear membership or associate speech with membership in specific speech communities, and that they will have specific attitudinal responses to different productions. Next. On Spanish perception, it's somewhat nascent, but studies have shown that listeners are able to distinguish between dialects and associate some indexical meaning with a particular phonetic realization. Next. Regarding Dominican Spanish, the coda liquids, the vocalization of coda liquids, are found primarily to be among lower socioeconomic levels and among older speakers. At least those were the findings of Alba 30 years ago. More recently, Acosta finds very high rates of vocalization in rural speakers. And then we also have reports of urban Spanish speakers of all socioeconomic levels producing this vocalization. Dominicans generally have negative attitudes toward their own variety, and they have been shown to associate particular phonetic variants with with a particular dialect within the Dominican Republic. Next. Our research questions are: what role does a hearer's education, family, language exposure, and travel have on the regional characterization of phonetic variants, adjective associations, and the ratings of 4 adjectives? Overall, what does this say about speech attitudes in Dominican Spanish among speakers from a middle-upper socioeconomic background? Next. Our methodology was to have stimuli from 2 actors from the Cibao produce all the different variants. We had 73 listeners who are all educated students at the university in Santiago. We used Qualtrics, head-mounted or headphones, and our statistical analysis is a mixed effect logistic regression model. Next. Here's an example of what the actors produced and that the listeners heard. These were all in carrier phrases, the same carrier phrase to avoid any other variables. And can we listen to this?
La palabra clave era algo. La palabra clave era algo. La palabra clave era algo.
Okay, very good. So we had 2 actors, 3 variants, 2 repetitions, 19 words, 228 evaluations per person, and a total of 16,000 plus evaluations. Next. So for our research questions, this is a sample of the Qualtrics that they did for the geographic terms. They either had a heat map, they heard a sound and they had to identify it, where on the map, or they identified in written form where that person was from. Next. This is a descriptive adjective selection. They heard an audio and they had to choose all the adjectives that applied. Next. And in this question, they had an adjective and they had to indicate how in agreement or in disagreement they were using a slider. Our independent variables were the liquid phenomena itself, with 6 social variables: participant years of L2 study, the participant education, average education, or the parents, whether or not there was an in-home service worker, participant monthly travel, and the parent's monthly travel outside of the CBAO.
All right, thank you, Eric. So I'm going to go through the tasks and some of the statistical measures we used to analyze them. So the first task involved geographic associations, where here is identify the region where the stimulus was produced. Their possible responses included the East, the Northern CBAO, the South, another country, or I don't know. Based on previous research, they matched up lateralization, vocalization, and eroticization with some region. We used a binary dependent variable that included matches with previous literature and mismatches in which identifications were not what we would expect. The normative productions were not included in this task. So in this model, there were three fixed effects, including education of the parent, the participant, the years of L2 study, and the liquid phenomenon. The conclusion here, we see at the left, the participant and the parent's education. As education increased, there was an increased mismatch of identifications. There was also one interaction here between the liquid phenomenon and the years of L2 study. We see here that with increased L2 exposure, there was reduced familiarity with vernacular styles outside of the CBAO. There was less identification of the non-vocalized variant. All right, for adjective selection, we looked at listeners selected any number of 8 adjectives to describe stimulus. These were divided based on covert versus overt prestige of the adjectives. So we had personal adjectives, which included humble, from the inner city, kind, urban, and attractive, and professional adjectives, including intelligent, professional, and cultured. The normative production was included in this task. Within the model, there were 3 fixed effects, including years of L2 study, parents' education, and liquid phenomena, and 2 interactions. At left, we see the interaction between the phenomenon and the parents' education. With increased parent education, there was more stigma for non-CBAO regional productions, that is lateralization and eroticization. For the interaction between phenomenon and the time studying in L2, more L2 exposure led to less distinction between the normative production and the other variants. Finally, for the rating task, here's rated stimuli across 4 adjectives from 0 to 100. For from the inner city, educated, humble, and sincere. We developed models just for from the inner city and educated, using here ratings as continuous because humble and sincere did not have a statistically significant difference between ratings across production types. The normative productions were included in this task. In this model, there were 2 fixed effects for the adjective from the inner city. Years of L2 study and liquid phenomenon, and 1 interaction seen at left, the phenomenon versus the years of L2 study. With more exposure to an L2, participants had less perceptual distinction between the variants, possibly due to less exposure to vernacular varieties. Then for the adjective educado, educated, there were 4 fixed effects and 3 interactions. The first seen at left was between the phenomenon and education. We see that with more education, there was less distinction between variants. The same was the case between parents' travel and the phenomenon, where the distinction decreased. However, with service worker education, more educated service workers correlated with a greater awareness of regional variant stigma and a higher rating of the normative variant as educated. So now we'll go to the research questions, the first of which dealt with the regional categorization. We saw that speakers identify regional varieties at a rate above chance. This supports claims that there's sociolinguistic value for these variables. Education L2 seem to be stand-ins for socioeconomic status to some extent. Class divisions can limit some of these college-educated participants' contact with vernacular styles. And here's from CBAO. I'll note we're most successful at identifying vocalization, which was also from CBAO, which follows previous research that one can best identify their varieties of variants from within their own variety, that is. For the adjective associations, personal adjectives were used the most, greater than 90%, to identify all but the normative production. This follows previous expectations in research. For parent education, as it increased, rating vocalization and normative productions were higher as professional, and lateralization and eroticization were rated more as personal, using those adjective categories. Overt prestige may not be attributed to some of these non-local variants. Class divisions may also limit speakers' contact with lateralization and eroticization. And there is research to show that vocalization has covert prestige in CBAO among young men, which may lead to its higher rating as more professional. Finally, increased L2 study leads to less distinction between the variants, which is expected based on previous research. Potentially with greater L2 study and study abroad, speakers may have less exposure to different varieties of Dominican Spanish. For the rating task, we see that increased education and parent travel leads to less familiarity with attitudinal perceptions. Speakers with a higher socioeconomic status identify a reduced degree of social stigma across the non-normative productions. And for service worker education, as it increased, there was more distinction between phenomena. The normative productions were seen as more educated, and the vocalized variants as less educated, which may be a prescriptive effect. Finally, to wrap up, what does this say about speakers' about speech attitudes among these hearers who are mainly from a middle and upper socioeconomic background. While liquid productions are subject to variable perceptual identification, class divisions may reduce some participants' contact with vernacular styles, especially outside their home region. Speakers with connections and language learning in America and Europe may have less contact with Dominican Spanish. Overall, attitudinal differences provide insight into Dominican society. While speakers do show awareness of regional variation, social evaluation is not categorical. Attitudes are built on individual factors, such as education, travel, and socioeconomic status.
All right, thank you very much. We have about 3 minutes for questions. Will, do we have any Zoom questions queued up? Okay, well, I'll give you guys on Zoom a chance. Anyone in the room? If you do have a question in the room, let's go up to this mic here so that the Zoom folks can hear you okay.
Stuart.
Yeah, that was very, very fast. I just want to get something, a clarification point. So the vocalization variant was rated more positively than the other two variants, and the one that was rated most negatively was the rhoticization of the L to the rhotic R. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm not finding it right now, but yes, essentially that is true. Is that although there were some effects of education, in general, vocalization was rated more positively along several lines.
Is there any reason why that variant would be rated more positively than the other variants? I'm just kind of curious.
Possibly a cover prestige because that's part of the vernacular in the area that the speakers are from.
I get it. Yeah, but
Right.
I'm just
Okay, we
wondering
have
if there were. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry, thanks. We have a question in the room.
Hi, Nicole Holiday, Pomona College. Thank you. Very interesting work. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to the covert prestige that you mentioned super briefly, especially as it interacts with the fact that you didn't find any judgments for these personality type characteristics like sincerity and humbleness. So there's sort of a strong class-based effect, but if you have any sort of sense about how that interacts with personal judgments. Thanks.
So, but one thing, sure, one thing about covert prestige that Acosta talks about is just that a lot of younger male speakers actively produce the vocalized variant, but also rate it as being the speech of uneducated people and elderly people. So they don't see it as part of their own speech norms. And so potentially there's not the same degree of salience or awareness for some reason. But the fact that humble and sincere did not come up as significant was interesting. I don't know if it's just because of maybe the valence of those specific words or something else.
Time for one more quick question if anyone has one. All right, well, in that case, let's set up for our second speaker. Thank you so much.